and a cup of coffee, so hopefully my brain will be working. Before we start, I'll make two confessions. One, when we made that movie, I hadn't realized that the sweater I was wearing was completely eaten by clothes moths. It looks like it'd been chewed by mice. So that was like, nature is not always a benevolent thing. And secondly, over the last few months, I keep meeting people who are convinced that I've spent, this pandemic lockdown period going outside to find deeper solace in the woods and hills around my house, like in the video. But I wanted to say, I've actually been coping with the pandemic in a very different way. Most of the time I've been sitting on my sofa or lying on it under a blanket, eating pints of ice cream and watching action movies. That's basically how I've been dealing with it. So yeah, there we go. I put it on the table now. So anyway, so as many of you will know, H is for Hawk was a memoir, and it was about how, following the death of my beloved father, I decided to deal with my grief by training a highly predatory and highly strung bird of prey. I don't recommend this as a way of dealing with grief generally, but that's what I did. And my new book, as the video just said, is a collection of essays. And I want to talk a little bit, I think, to start with about, what I said in that film about how essays it was a word that always gave me the sort of shuddering horrors and panic. Because it really was the case. I never did essays at school. I never did my homework. And then when I went to university, it got even worse. And I'm never going to forget the sort of, to start with, my tutors' faces would be sort of disappointed. And eventually it became, seriously exasperated irritation as the sort of weeks and months went past. I was a disaster. And I finally worked out the problem. And the problem was that I simply couldn't write essays the way that I was told I ought to. I love to research. That wasn't a problem. The problem was that I kept being told that I had to make very detailed plans before I wrote my essays, and I had to write down what my introduction would say and what each paragraph would say, and then what the conclusion would say, and then write the essay. And I found this so impossible that it stopped me writing at all. But if you put me in an exam hall, I was fine. I was full of adrenaline, there's a ticking clock, and what I do is start writing, and I just sort of follow the sentences down the page. And it always felt a little bit like white water rafting. It was very exhilarating and very scary, and it required a lot of constant attention to where I was and where I was going, and sometimes a lot of frantic back paddling and crossings out. But in exams, the words always came, and I never ever made a plan. And I think in terms of craft, I write essays like I write exams. It's like the world poses me a question, and I do my best to answer it. And I feel my way through all the ramifications and the wider significances of what I'm trying to think about. And I know now that when I write, I need to be writing to actually think at all. As I'm writing an essay and trying to puzzle something out, something I've seen or something that I've noticed or I've read, something magical happens. It sort of feels a little bit like I'm writing with the reader right next to me. It's sort of, I'm puzzling out what the essay is saying with a reader there. And it feels like a sort of shared space that I'm opening out. Like I said, like a kind of conversation, even though obviously necessarily it's kind of one-sided. So basically, like these days, although I love writing longer forms, I really do believe that my brain is wired really, really well for essays. And that's made Vesper Flights a really special book for me. And I really, really hope if you read it, you like it. We're living in exceedingly frightening times. We've got the climate emergency, obviously, accelerating biodiversity loss. It's terrifying. And obviously the current political situation is not optimal. And that's meant that this book is a lot more overtly political than H is for Hawk. And I'm very glad about that. I don't like to tell people what to feel or think. I'm a very contrary person. Ask my mother if you ever meet her, she'll be like, clean your room. No, I'm never cleaning my room when I was a kid. So I'm not good at telling people what to do or think. But I think there's a lot of urgency in the pages of the book. And I hope that is a sort of contagious sense that readers will catch. Because it's not just a book about the ways we see the natural world. It's about this notion of hope and how we can sustain it. And I always think of Mariam Kaba's statement that hope is a discipline that we have to kind of really fight to maintain right now. And then I think of Rebecca Solnit, who, and I'm paraphrasing her wildly here, but she says that, if you're optimistic about the future, you don't do anything. You just sort of sit back and relax. If you're extremely pessimistic and despairing and think we have no hope, also you have no agency, you don't do anything, you just sit at home and cry. What you need to kind of generate is a sense of uncertainty. And in that space of uncertainty is where you can feel that you can make a change. And I've been thinking a lot about that lately. And Solnit says, to hope is to give yourself to the future. And that commitment to the future is what makes the present inhabitable. So they're my little watchwords for this book. And there's a lot of memoir in it too. So people who met me in Ages for Hawk as a kind of very miserable 30-something will also meet me as a very small, weird child wandering around climbing trees and catching snakes and getting into scrapes, as an angst-ridden university student with a constantly broken heart who smoked filterless Camels and was just also quite miserable, to be honest. And a 20-something person living in a Welsh farmhouse that was full of rats and leaks and extremely eccentric co-workers. So there's lots of me in the book. It's not just, you know, essays about things. But what I want to do now is I really want to introduce you to one of the deepest themes of the book with a kind of autobiography. I want to tell you the story of how I came to understand some really important things about the relationship between the human world and the natural world, and how those realizations have shaped the way I think and write. And I hope this story in a sort of small way will maybe shed light on how we see ourselves more generally and how we use nature to speak of things that often we think we cannot say at all. It's a sort of mouthpiece for a lot of things we find hard to say. Because stories about nature, it turns out, tend to always be stories at heart about ourselves. So I'm going to start with 5-year-old me. Again, that strange child. My parents moved that year to a house in the south of England on a very old country estate that was owned by the Theosophical Society. I don't know how many of you know of this society. It was extremely popular in the 19th century. It was a kind of spiritualist society. And my mum and dad were not only agnostic, but journalists, and not only agnostic journalists, but hard-bitten agnostic journalists. So this is a very unusual environment for them to choose to move to. And it was a really surprising place. I remember the week we moved in, I think this man walked up the road naked to post a letter, and this sort of thing was quite normal. I think there was another chap who lived in Nepal who used to send his beard clippings back to be burned on the estate bonfire. And there was another man who, when he discovered I was going to Cambridge University, said, "Where do you stable your horse? I found it was very difficult to find good stabling for my hunter when I was there in 1937 or something." I mean, it was a very, very surprising bunch of people. And a lot of them were very elderly ladies, and some of them were refugees from Nazi Germany because theosophy had been banned by the Nazi regime. And they did things like, some of them had jewelry. One of them had a necklace that was given to her by Howard Carter, Tutankhamun fame. And another one kept a great auk egg in a drawer. And they were fantastically inspiring to me because they lived their lives according to their own precepts and their own, they were sort of 2 fingers up at social expectations. And I think I've sort of carried that legacy on a bit. But the estate's real magic for me was that it was full of life. And I had this really free childhood. And I kind of ran around and spent hours on my own, and all that I did was look for living things. And I sort of turned over rocks and picked up bugs, and I filled jars and aquaria with newts and frogs. And I put my face down in the grass of the meadow, and I'd look for sort of tiny little insects moving around like the size of punctuation marks. And you know, the sort of sense of scale of the world shifted for me then. I could see that there were microcosms within it. And, you know, I wasn't an unhappy child, but I was a very alone child. And I thought these animals made the world bigger and more complicated and interesting. And I craved their company. And I got all these field guides out of libraries, and I bought these field guides because I wanted to know their names, just like I wanted to know the names of my friends at school. And all these beasts kind of expanded my sense of my home beyond the walls of the house, and they made the natural world seem a place of glorious safety and beauty for me. And I think that, you know, so often we think of nature these days as something we should test ourselves against, or set ourselves against it, or define ourselves against it. And this was nothing like that. This was a very different way of looking at nature. It was kind of a child's way of relating to the natural world. And then, of course, I was obsessed with hawks. So I think a lot of you know that already. I was a child, you know, all my friends at school had pictures of kind of the Osmonds and the Bay City Rollers and other terrible 1970s English rock bands on their walls. And I had pictures of hawks and falcons. And I became a falconer, and I flew hawks for many, many years. And then I went to university, and suddenly there was no time to fly hawks anymore. And it was during this, I did an English degree. My maths was terrible. I couldn't be a biologist. I was a bit of a failure there. So I did English, which is my other great love, was literature. And I discovered, I think, for the first time, how to read properly. And I discovered that books and poems were far bigger and deeper than they'd seen before, that they weren't just stories, that they really were full of this extraordinary sort of material within them that sort of shed a light on the cultures and the minds that wrote them. And I was really interested in this notion of like investigating history through looking at literature. And also I was very angsty, and I lost myself in writing poetry, and I broke my heart, and I learned a lot about post-structuralism. And I forgot about hawks completely, but then they came back, because when I left university, I went rather counterintuitively to work in the Gulf states on conservation issues with the kinds of falcons that are traditionally used in Arab falconry. So this is a really interesting subject. So back in the day, before oil really hit the Gulf, these falcon species would migrate from Central Asia, where they bred, and they'd migrate over the Arabian Peninsula down to Africa, where they'd spend the winter. And then in the spring, they'd fly back. And as they flew, Bedouin falconers would trap them and train them and fly them for the winter to get food, and then they'd let them go again so they could continue their journey. It was a very sustainable way of using a wildlife resource, and very, very old. But at this time, the Iron Curtain had fallen. There's a lot of oil money sloshing around, and a lot of smuggling gangs had got involved in basically just taking birds from the wild and just bringing them to the Gulf. And it was causing terrible problems for the populations of birds in Central Asia and across Asia. And while I was there, we were sort of working on this problem, and I kept seeing these big Western conservation initiatives failing, because none of them seemed to take into account the incredibly deep emotional and cultural meaning of these birds to the people that were keeping them. And I thought, this is really interesting. This is really interesting. I want to think about this and think about it very carefully. So I went back to university, and some part of me, I think, had finally realized that my subject wasn't literature as such. It was the curiosity of that small child who was catching snakes and turning over rocks. I wanted to know how animals helped us how to live. And I remembered all the ways that I'd learned to analyze books and poems, and I determined that I'd use those skills to think about animals in our lives. And I got really interested at that point in the cultures of natural history in Britain around the time of the Second World War, which is, as many of you know, is a very foundational kind of element of how Britain sees itself, for good or ill, is the Second World War. So I spent a lot of time in the University Library, another eccentric place in Cambridge, and I dug out all these magazines and books and read them all. And I just got absolutely obsessed. I mean, I'm quite an obsessive person, but this was amazing, the stuff I was finding. Because, we think of science as this ultimately dispassionate and objective way that we engage with the world. And of course, we need hard science, the modeling, the conclusions, it's all, we need this approximation of what the world is. But it turns out that science is inflected, and the questions it asks are really shaped by the times that it's done in. And that science itself, like biological science, can be, I discovered, just as much about the people, about ourselves, as the animals. So here's an example. There was a scientist called James Fisher, an ornithologist back then, lots of tweed. I'm wearing tweed now. I thought this was a really cool outfit, and then I realized I like Jason Statham in Spy. It's not really a very good outfit. But so James Fisher was really obsessed with a kind of seabird called a fulmar, which is a kind of little miniature albatross. And at that time, it was spreading really, really quickly down north from Iceland and around the British coast, mainly because it turned out it was just eating a lot of fish that was chucked off trawling at the time. And he wrote this monograph on fulmars, which I read, and I was like, huh, what? It's full of invasion anxiety. So he writes about their detailed range expansion, mile by mile around the British coast. He talks about their encirclement and penetration of Britain. And he got military coastal command stations to look out for fulmars as well as enemy aircraft during the war. And he even arranged RAF reconnaissance training flights to photograph fulmar nesting cliffs. I think he was pretty well connected, to be honest, but that, And he kept writing stuff in this book, and it was like, you know, mile by mile, they keep coming. I do not know when they will stop, you know. It's a book about invasion anxiety as much as it's about a bird. It's as much about war as birds. And I just kept finding this stuff, more and more and more of it. Bird migration became a really, really fascinating topic at the time. I remember reading about Norfolk farmers who discovered that the skylarks that ate their crops in the winter had flown over from Germany, and they started shooting them. And there were these headlines in the local newspapers saying, skylarks that sing to Nazis will get no mercy here, you know. So wildlife itself was becoming kind of laden with national identity in a really, really strong way. So there's a naturalist called Peter Scott, very famous naturalist in this country, who I remember when he left the British shoreline on the deck of a destroyer. He was in the Navy, and he was on the channel looking back at the cliffs of Dover, and it was raining, you know, and he looked back and he realized that the reason he wanted to fight was to protect the ducks that nested in the reeds behind his house. That was why he wanted to fight the war. And of course, these species of ducks nest all over Europe, you know, they're not British ducks, but to him, they were England. There were talks on the radio from Julian Huxley, the scientist, another scientist, who said that from, you know, British landscapes can look very much like American landscapes, but if you know your bird song, you know, then you will understand where you truly are. You know, to know your countryside is to know you're British. It's the essence of what being a British person is. I'll do one more example, because these are so much fun. A very, very renowned population ecologist, Charles Elton, who discovered the lemming cycles, many of you know. He wrote that when you see an animal, you should know exactly what its role is in the ecological community. And, you know, his notion of what that community is like was basically the social structure of an English village. So he said, when you see a badger, you should know its place in the community, just as if you'd said, there goes the vicar. So it's everywhere. And I was just discovering that when you talk about the natural world, what you're really doing is talking about yourself and your society. And that was really thought-provoking for me, because I always think of the way that nature works like this as being a bit like that quote from Baudelaire that was stolen by The Usual Suspects. You know, the greatest trick the devil ever played was to convince us that he didn't exist. We're taught to believe that nature is free of all politics, all human content, all things like that. But it's where we hide it all. And we use it, we see it there, we put it there, we see it there as natural, and then we use it to prove our ideas about the world back to ourselves. And that process is called naturalization. And it's, I think it's a really interesting one. I think, for example, of that essay by Annie Dillard on meeting a weasel, it's a wonderful essay, and I'm sure many of you have read it. And she sees this weasel, and she looks into its eyes, and she sees in its eyes this creature that's built out of the perfect freedom of necessity, single necessity, she says. And it's like, it's a kind of a teaching moment that we should all grasp our one necessity and not let it go. And I read that and I thought, that's amazing. But like, I'm sure weasels are more than that. I'm sure they're not just kind of wolves of Wall Street. I'm sure that also maybe they have hurt legs, or they play, or they sun themselves, or they have kids, you know. Animals are always more than we want them to be. Every single meeting is more than we can say. And then another little side thing here, I used to go out bird watching quite a lot around Cambridge, and the countryside around Cambridge is not like where I grew up, just kind of woods and forests and fields. A lot of it's very marshy. So I found myself in these environments where I'd look out with my binoculars and all I could see was a sort of sea of reeds, and, you know, there was sort of wind moving on the surface. And it was really frustrating and sometimes incredibly boring, because I couldn't see anything in these places. I used to sit, actually, sometimes I'd sit by a kind of channel through the reeds, or it's a path, and I'd just wait for animals to appear. And yeah, no, that didn't work. And I sort of learned, I think then, that the ways in which we're supposed to find animals or look at them are also, you know, we've been taught them. And I learned to listen. And, you know, I'd hear a faint squelch, and that would be like a kind of teal, a duck kind of feeding in a pool, or I'd hear a hissing kind of like shuffling fit, and that was maybe an otter or a snake moving through the reeds. It was a really interesting way of changing how my senses work with the natural world. It's a lesson I'm sure many people have learned much earlier than me, but it came to me late. And then this other thing happened, and that was whenever I saw creatures in the reeds, I only ever saw bits of them. So I'd see like maybe a little kind of little eyebrow of a warbler or an upcocked tail, or maybe a sort of little patch of fur that was moving that could have been anything really, a vole or an otter. And I learned to sort of identify them in pieces over a long period of many, many, many sightings. And then I started thinking about how, when we think about animals, we often think of them as these great big photographic clear images, or we think of them as these kind of schematic pictures in field guides. And that cuts them out from the landscape around them. It makes them separate from the landscape. And what was happening as I watched these birds in this weird landscape and watched these creatures was I started to see them. In fact, I even stopped using binoculars after a while. I just used to watch them with my naked eye. And I realized that it pleated the animal and the landscape together in a really interesting way. It made the animal and the landscape one thing. And that was another lesson that I think has really shaped the way I think about the natural world. This is quite sort of self-absorbed, this essay, but I hope it's getting across some of the things that I think course through the book. I think a lot of us, again, have been handed this notion that to be out in the countryside, it gives us solace, and it's a place that's free of judgment. And you know, ask any person of color who lives in Britain whether they feel welcome in the countryside, and I think you'll find that isn't the case. It's traditionally been the realm of, you know, white, middle class or posh men over here. And I think, you know, another confession, slightly more serious than the fact that I've been watching a lot of action movies, is that even now I still struggle with the intuition sometimes that because I'm not a man, I don't possess quite enough authority to talk about nature or to write about nature. You know, it's not for me. And it's a really obvious point, but I think there are so many voices about nature that we just haven't been able to hear. And, you know, it's really urgent that we get to hear them. You know, some of the most extraordinary natural historians I've ever met grew up in marginal working class rural communities. And there's very little room for them in today's cultures of nature appreciation, and even less room in the cultures of nature writing, which tends to sort of see nature as this sort of reserved thing that you encounter through sort of walking and distanced looking. You don't get your hands dirty. So, I mean, this is I am being quite polemical now, I guess, but I think more than ever, we need more variousness in people writing about nature. We need to hear the words of Black writers, of people of color, of people from, again, marginal communities, of trans and women writers. You know, nature it's not a singular thing. And nor are we, and nor are the practices that take us to it. So that's a really important thing, I think. But I guess towards the end of this, you know, the big question that's always been, what's the question at the heart of nature writing ever since Thoreau is how to live. And I think my answer to that question is what all these lessons that I've sort of, you know, been teaching myself, I guess, have taught me, and that is there isn't really one right way to look at nature. But we should fight with all we have to preserve it and to keep in play all these lives that are not like our own. We need landscapes that are buzzing and glowing with life, basically. And I think to be truly human, we have to exercise our empathy muscles, and we have to learn to love things that aren't like us. And I think we have to mourn now, you know? We have to mourn what's disappearing through habitat loss and pesticides and climate crisis. You know, the world seems ever darker, quieter, and smaller, and we need to feel that grief. We shouldn't dissociate ourselves from it. It needs to be a reality in our hearts, because unless we mourn it, we can't step forward and try and change things. And I think overall, I mean, I think of this lovely poem by the poet Frank O'Hara about, as a tribute to the Martinican poet Aimé Césaire, as a line that just chimes with me every time. And it's like, you know, we have to fight for what we love, not are. And that, I think, is a really important thing for me. So yeah, we should just get out there, pay attention to it, believe it belongs to everyone, it does. And no matter what boundaries have been put up to stop you feeling that it's yours too, it is. Pay attention, I think, is what I would say, and see what's there and learn to love it. And then when you see an animal, when you see a landscape, or let's say a creature, I think it's really important now, knowing that, you know, a lot of the meanings that you see in the animal are human meanings we've given it, to try and hold those meanings in your head when you look at the animal. And there's a bit of a trick. If you know those meanings, you can kind of sometimes just push them aside slightly and see this phenomenally alien, astonishing kind of non-human being in front of you. And I think the real magic is that sometimes the animals can do that for you. And I don't think it's too much to say that encounters with animals can be serious magic. So I want to end by just talking about a little experience I had in New Zealand a few years ago when I went out to a headland near Dunedin, right at the edge of the sea, feeling very jet lagged and very peculiar because everything seemed upside down in my head. And I wanted to see something, but I didn't know whether I'd see it at all. And there were these welcome swallows overhead, these lovely curlicues, these lovely, a bit like barn swallows in sort of weird colours. And down at the bottom of the cliffs, there was a little pool full of porpoises that were kind of porpoising around. And I stood there and my heart was in my mouth. I wanted something to happen. I didn't know whether it would, but I didn't think it would happen because for it to happen, it needed to be windy, and there was no wind at all. Everything was like dead still. And I remember looking down at this sort of fishing boat bobbing on the waves. It was like the size of a thumbnail, and I thought, it's not going to happen. And I prepared myself to be disappointed because nature often disappoints. It doesn't produce things when you want it to happen. But then the wind came, and suddenly, and it was a venison, and it rolled in off the ocean, and there in front of us, about sort of 20 or 30 yards away, this sort of weird white lump started to move. It looked like a small child in a ghost outfit. It had these kind of weird stick-like things that were kind of wobbling around, and they were wings that were covered in down, and it was a young albatross. A young royal albatross. It was 100 days old, and for 100 days it had sat there looking out to sea. And when I looked at it, it was kind of comical, but I couldn't help thinking of Theseus's ships, of the black sails coming home, and of Coleridge's albatross and Baudelaire's albatross, like a good literature student, and all of our imperial visions of global exploration where the albatrosses would follow the ships across the ocean. And, romantic notions of solitude. These are very solitary birds. And then caught up with Coleridge's albatross, of course, was this biting sense of guilt because, we're doing terrible things to the natural world, and albatrosses mean guilt in the literary tradition. And all these old stories started to be conjured when I looked at this baby bird. And then the wind continued to blow, and then the albatross came, the adult albatross. And it came in from the ocean, and it was too big to understand. It was as if a dog were hanging there in the air. And it came in on the wind, and it had these long, knife-like wings that were bowed, and its webbed feet were spread like rudders. It was the most astonishing thing. And it turned its head, and as it curved in, and it looked right at me down this, with sort of mild Madonna-like eyes down this long squid-cutting beak. And I was absolutely lost for words. And its world was wind and sea and spray and salt, and the uplift from rolling swell over the southern oceans. And it looked right through all the stories I'd ever been told about the world, and the air shivered with its newness. Thank you.